In the last episode of this series, we saw Bobby Isaac claim his first championship in dominating fashion over Bobby Allison. So today, we're going to cover the last year of the Pioneer era and give the 1971 season a consistent points format. In 1971, we had 5 drivers worth mentioning. 1970 runner-up Bobby Allison, Cecil Gordon, Richard Petty, James Hilton, and Elmo Langley. In the opening 8 races, only one full-time driver won races, and that would be Richard Petty. Petty would win 4 races, the first coming at the Daytona 500, and then would go 3 in a row at Richmond, Rockingham, and Hickory. And after the first 8 races, to the absolute shock of no one, Richard Petty would have a commanding 211-point lead over James Hilton. Over the next 8 races, Richard Petty would win 4 races, and this would put him at 8 wins of his first 16 starts. That is simply unbelievable. Richard Petty would be so consistent, and after 16 races, Richard Petty now had a whopping lead of 435 points. At race 17 in South Boston, Petty finished second and Hilton finished third, extending the gap to 445 points. At Talladega, Hilton finished 7th and Petty finished 38th, and the gap shrunk all the way to 361 points. At Asheville, Petty bounced back with a win while Hilton finished 17th, and the gap was now back to 434 points. At Kingsport, Hilton finished 3rd while Petty finished 17th, and the gap shrunk to 386 points. At Charlotte, Petty finished 4th while Hilton finished 13th, and the gap was now 417 points. At Dover, Petty finished 3rd while Hilton finished 6th, and the gap grew to 437 points. At Michigan, Petty finished 6th while Hilton finished 12th, and the gap extended to 460 points. At Riverside, Hilton finished 4th while Petty finished 13th, and halfway through the season, Richard Petty was definitely the championship favorite. And after the heartbreak of missing 7 races and missing out on a championship in the previous season, Richard Petty was looking for redemption in his 4th title. At Houston, Hilton finished 2nd and Petty finished 7th, and the gap shrunk slightly to 405 points. At Greenville, Petty won the race while Hilton finished 12th, and the gap was now 458 points. At Daytona, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 9th, and the gap grew to 495 points. At Bristol, Petty finished 3rd while Hilton finished 5th, and the gap grew to 510 points. At Malta, Petty would submit himself as the number 1 driver on the season and go win on the next 4 races in a row. And now with 16 races to go, with a lock for the title with a massive 632-point lead over James Hilton. At Atlanta, Petty would win his 5th race in a row and now had a 679-point lead over Hilton. At Winston-Salem, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 22nd, and the gap was now 757 points. At Ona, Petty won the race while Hilton finished 3rd, and the gap was now 777 points. At Michigan, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 8th, and the gap was now 810 points. At Talladega, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 5th, and the gap once again grew to 830 points. At Columbia, Petty won his 17th race of the season, while Hilton finished 4th, and the gap grew to 855 points. At Hickory, Petty finished 3rd while Hilton finished 6th, and the gap grew to 870 points. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 6th, and the gap was now 895 points. At Martinsville, Petty finished 3rd while Hilton finished 9th, the gap was now 927 points. And that gave Richard Petty enough cushion to lock up the championship 7 races early, and Richard Petty in this timeline was now a 4-time champion. So, what is there really to say about this season? Petty just simply dominated. This season was very reminiscent of his famous 1967 season, but in my opinion, this season is not talked about enough and is in my opinion a little underrated and overshadowed by his 1967 season. But nonetheless, Richard Petty would cap off the Pioneer era with his 4th championship. Well, that will do it for today, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week for 1972.